Iambic pentameter aɪwɔmbɪk pɛnṭæmᵻtər is a commonly used type of metrical line in traditional English poetry and verse drama. The term describes the rhythm that the words establish in that line, which is measured in small groups of syllables called feet. The word iambic refers to the type of foot that is used, known as the iamb, which in English is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. The word pentameter indicates that the line has 5 of these feet. Iambic rhythms come relatively naturally in English. Iambic pentameter is the most common meter in English poetry. It is used in many of the major English poetic forms, including blank verse, the heroic couplet, and some of the traditional rhymed stanza forms. William Shakespeare used iambic pentameter in his plays and sonnets. Meter, sample, example. An iambic foot is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. The rhythm can be written as da-dum. The da-dum of a human heartbeat is the most common example of this rhythm. A standard line of iambic pentameter is 5 iambic feet in a row. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Straightforward examples of this rhythm can be heard in the opening line of William Shakespeare's Sonnet 12, when I'd count the clock that tells the time, and in John Keats' To Autumn, to swell the good and plump the hazel shells. It is possible to notate this with a marking ictic syllables and their times marking non-ictic syllables. In this notation, a standard line of iambic pentameter would look like this: times, 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 times. The scansion of the examples above can be notated as follows: times, 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 times. When I'd count the clock that tells the time, times, 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 to swell the good and plump the hazel shells. I am in classical and English verse. The term iamb originally applied to the quantitative meter of classical poetry. The classical terms were adapted to describe the equivalent meters in English accentual syllabic verse. Different languages express rhythm in different ways. In ancient Greek and Latin, the rhythm was created through the alternation of short and long syllables. In English, the rhythm is created through the use of stress, alternating between unstressed and stressed syllables. An English unstressed syllable is equivalent to a classical short syllable, while an English stressed syllable is equivalent to a classical long syllable. When a pair of syllables is arranged as a short followed by a long, or an unstressed followed by a stressed pattern, the foot is said to be iambic. The English word trapeze is an example of an iambic pair of syllables, since the word is made up of 2 syllables and is pronounced with the stress on the second syllable. A line of iambic pentameter is made up of 5 such pairs of short, long, or unstressed, stressed syllables. Rhythmic variation. Although strictly speaking, iambic pentameter refers to 5 iambs in a row, in practice, poets vary their iambic pentameter a great deal, while maintaining the iamb as the most common foot. However, there are some conventions to these variations. Iambic pentameter must always contain only 5 feet, and the second foot is almost always an iamb. The first foot, in contrast, often changes by the use of inversion, which reverses the order of the syllables in the foot. The following line from Shakespeare's Richard III begins with an inversion: times, 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 times. Now is the winter of our discontent. Another common departure from standard iambic pentameter is the addition of a final unstressed syllable, which creates a weaker feminine ending. One of Shakespeare's most famous lines of iambic pentameter has a weak ending: times, 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 times. To be and not to be, that is the question. This line also has an inversion of the 4th foot, following the caesura. In general, a caesura acts in many ways like a line end. Inversions are common after it, and the extra unstressed syllable of the feminine ending may appear before it. Shakespeare Shakespeare and John Milton at times employed feminine endings before a caesura. Here is the first quatrain of a sonnet by John Donne, which demonstrates how he uses a number of metrical variations strategically. This scansion adds numbers to indicate how Donne uses a variety of stress levels to realize his beats and offbeats. 4 1 1 4 3 4 1 4 1 2 times batter my heart 3% God for you times as yet but knock breathe shine and seek to mend 1 2 1 4 1 4 2 4 1 4 times that I may rise and stand, O earth, throw me and bend 1 4 1 4 3 4 1 4 1 4 times you're forced to break, blow, burn and make me new. Donne uses an inversion in the first foot of the first line to stress the key verb batter, and then sets up a clear iambic pattern with the rest of the line. In the second and fourth lines he uses strongly stressed offbeats in the third foot to slow down the rhythm as he lists monosyllabic verbs. The parallel rhythm and grammar of these lines highlights the comparison Donne sets up between what God does to him as yet, and what he asks God to do. Donne also uses enjambment between lines 3 and 4 to speed up the flow as he builds to his desire to be made new. To further the speed-up effect of the enjambment, Donne puts an extra syllable in the final foot of the line or as an elision. As the examples show, iambic pentameter need not consist entirely of iambs, nor need it have 10 syllables. Most poets who have a great facility for iambic pentameter frequently vary the rhythm of the poetry as Donne and Shakespeare do in the examples, both to create a more interesting overall rhythm and to highlight important thematic elements. In fact, the skillful variation of iambic pentameter, rather than the consistent use of it, may well be what distinguishes the rhythmic artistry of Donne, Shakespeare, Milton, and the 20th century sonneteer Edna St. Vincent Millay. Several scholars have argued that iambic pentameter has been so important in the history of English poetry by contrasting it with the one other important meter, variously called 4-beat, strong stress, native meter, or 4x4 meter. Quote, 4-beat, with 4 beats to a line, is the meter of nursery rhymes, children's jump rope and counting out rhymes, folk songs and ballads, marching cadence calls, and a good deal of art poetry. It has been described by Attridge as based on doubling, 2 beats to each half line, 2 half lines to a line, 2 pairs of lines to a stanza. The metrical stresses alternate between light and heavy. It is a heavily regular beat that produces something like a repeated tune in the performing voice, and is, indeed, close to song. Because of its odd number of metrical beats, iambic pentameter, as Attridge says, does not impose itself on the natural rhythm of spoken language. Thus iambic pentameter frees intonation from the repetitiveness of 4-beat and allows instead the varied intonations of significant speech to be heard. Pace can be varied in iambic pentameter, as it cannot in 4-beat, as Alexander Pope demonstrated in his An Essay on Criticism. The last line is in fact an Alexandrine, an iambic hexameter, which occurs occasionally in some iambic pentameter texts as a variant line. Not only does Pope exemplify swiftness by rushing over 12 syllables in the place of 10, he actually implies 14 syllables in the place of 10, including 4 lightly stressed syllables between the first 2 ictuses times, flies o' earth unbending corn, and skims along the main. Moreover, iambic pentameter, instead of the steady alternation of lighter and heavier beats of 4-beat, permits principal accents, that is, accents on the most significant words, to occur at various points in a line line as long as they are on the even-numbered syllables, or on the first syllable in the case of an initial trochaic inversion. It is not the case, as is often alleged, that iambic pentameter is natural to English. Rather, it is that iambic pentameter allows the varied intonations and pace natural to significant speech to be heard along with the regular meter. Theories of iambic pentameter. aɪʻæmbɪk. Linguists Maurice Halley and Samuel Jake Isser developed the earliest theory of generative metrics, a set of rules that define those variations that are permissible in English iambic pentameter. Essentially, the Halley-Isser rules state that only stress maximum syllables are important in determining the meter. A stress maximum syllable is a stress syllable surrounded on both sides by weak syllables in the same syntactic phrase and in the same verse line. In order to be a permissible line of iambic pentameter, no stress maxima can fall on a syllable that is designated as a weak syllable in the standard, unvaried iambic pentameter pattern. In the done line, the word God is not a maximum. That is because it is followed by a pause. Similarly, the words you, mend, and bend are not maxima since they are each at the end of a line. Rewriting the done quatrain showing the stress maxima results in the following: times m times batter my heart 3% God, for you times m times m times as yet but knock breathe shine and seek to mend, times m times that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend, times m times m times you're forced to break, blow, burn and make me new. The Halley-Isser system has been criticized because it can identify passages of prose as iambic pentameter. Other scholars have revised Halley-Isser, and they, along with Halley and Isser, are known collectively as generative metrists. Later generative metrists pointed out that poets have often treated non-compound words of more than one syllable differently from monosyllables and compounds of monosyllables. Any normally weak syllable may be stressed as a variation if it is a monosyllable, but not if it is part of a polysyllable except at the beginning of a line or a phrase. Thus Shakespeare wrote in The Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 2, times. The four winds blow in from every coast, but wrote vanishingly few lines of the former of as gazelles leap a never-resting brook. The stress patterns are the same, and in particular, the normally weak third syllable is stressed in both lines. The difference is that in Shakespeare's line the stressed third syllable is a one-syllable word, for, whereas in the un-Shakespearean line it is part of a two-syllable word, gazelles. Pope followed such a rule strictly, Shakespeare fairly strictly, Milton much less, and Donne not at all, which may be why Ben Jonson said Donne deserved hanging for not keeping of accent. Derek Attridge has pointed out the limits of the generative approach. It has not brought us any closer to understanding why particular metrical forms are common in English, why certain variations interrupt the meter and others do not, or why meter functions so powerfully as a literary device. Generative metrists also fail to recognize that a normally weak syllable in a strong position will be pronounced differently, i.e., promoted, and so no longer weak. History. Latin verse included lines of 10 syllables. It is widely thought that some line of this length, perhaps in the Alcmanian meter, led to the 10-syllable line of some Old French chansons de geste such as the Song of Roland. Those Old French lines invariably had a caesura after the fourth syllable. This line was adopted with more flexibility by the troubadours of Provence in the 12th century, notably Chequeman, Bernard de Ventadorn, and Bertrand born. In both Old French and Old Provençal, the 10th syllable of the line was accented and feminine endings were common, in which case the line had 11 syllables. Italian poets such as Giacomo da Lentini, Boccaccio, Petrarch, and Dante adopted this line, generally using the 11-syllable form because most Italian words have feminine endings. They often used a pattern where the 4th syllable and the 5th were part of the same word, the opposite of the Old French line with its required pause after the 4th syllable. This pattern came to be considered typically Italian. Geoffrey Chaucer followed the Italian poets in his 10-syllable lines, placing his pauses freely and often using the Italian pattern, but he deviated from it by introducing a strong iambic rhythm and the variations described above. This was an iambic pentameter. Chaucer's friend John Gower used a similar meter in his poem In Praise of Peace. Chaucer's meter depended on the pronunciation of final e's that even by his time were probably silent. It was soon forgotten that they were ever pronounced, so later readers could not recognize his meter and found his lines rough. His Scottish followers of the century from 1420 to 1520, King James I, Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, and Gavin Douglas, seem to have understood his meter and came close to it. Dunbar, in particular, wrote poems in true iambic pentameter. In England, the poems of the 15th and early 16th centuries are in a wide variety of meters. Thomas Wyatt, for example, are often mixed iambic pentameters with other lines of similar length but different rhythm. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, on the other hand, used a strict 10-syllable line that was similar to the Old French line, with its pause after the 4th syllable, but typically had a regular iambic pattern, and had many of the modern types of variation. Thomas Sackville, in his 2 poems In the Mirror for Magistrates, used a similar line but with few caesuras. The result was essentially the normal iambic pentameter except for the avoidance of the Italian line. It was Philip Sidney, apparently influenced by Italian poetry, who used large numbers of Italian lines and thus is often considered to have reinvented iambic pentameter in its final form. He was also more adept than his predecessors in working polysyllabic words into the meter. However, Sidney avoided feminine endings. They appear more often in the work of such masters of iambic pentameter as Edmund Spenser and Shakespeare. Iambic pentameter became the prevalent meter in English. It was estimated in 1971 that at least 3/4 of all English poetry since Chaucer was in this meter. In 2014, playwright Mike Bartlett wrote the internationally successful play King Charles III in iambic pentameter. Reading in drama. There is some debate over whether works such as Shakespeare's were originally performed with the rhythm prominent, or whether the rhythm was embedded in the patterns of contemporary speech. In either case, when read aloud, such verse naturally follows an iambic beat. Scholars have explained that there are few stage directions in Shakespeare, because the verse serves that purpose. The dramatic action of the lines is related to the physical action required. The rhythm of iambic pentameter was emphasized in Kenneth Branagh's 2000 production of Love's Labour's Lost, in a scene where the protagonists tap dance to the "Have you now affection's men-at-arms" speech. In this case, each iamb is underscored with a flap step.